British science fiction author and writer Arthur C Clarke said, "The limits of the possible can only be defined by going beyond them into the impossible," meaning the possible also actually has always had its own limitations, weaknesses, deficiencies, and boundaries that we are not always able to recognize, or we're not always willing to admit to the limitations of the possible because we're always led, dominated, and governed by the idea of possibility, and that we can almost think, say, or do anything that we want or desire and get away with the consequences or results. But the reality and the truth actually has always been that the possible has always had its own limits that often goes unnoticed and unrecognized because of our own ignorance, frustration, despair, disorientation, crises, and obviously the desire for success, and obviously the pursuit of self-centric ends, and the chasing of hedonistic desires, evil ends, selfish motives, and so on and so forth. But we basically have to come to terms with the limits of the possible. We have to understand and come to the realization and draw the conclusion that the possible is not infinite, that the possible also has its own impossibilities because it has limits. But it is also true that the limits of the possible can only be defined, understood, and solved only when we're willing to dive into the impossible itself. So we basically have to dig down deep and delve into the impossible itself. We have to basically go beyond the limits of the possible in order to define the impossible and the limitations as well. So the moment we transcend the possible, or the moment we go beyond the limits of the possible, then we understand that the possible also has its own difficulties, challenges, complexities, and dangers, and that leads us to basically a confrontation and direct encounter with the impossible that we're able to deal with and sometimes resolve it and make great things possible. So the possible is directly connected with and has close resemblance and connection with the impossible, because the impossible reflects the possible, and the possible also has limits that can only be understood by exploring those limits and by going beyond into the realm of the impossible. So that's how the possible works. We have to have the willingness, the desire, the understanding to basically tackle the